Greetings, I'm Yvonne Stapp for Science for the Public, and I welcome you to our Contemporary Science program. Today, we discuss the rising incidence of breast cancer. Our guest is Gerald Denis, Professor of Medicine and Pharmacology at Boston University School of Medicine and co-director of the Boston University Cancer Center. Dr. Denis is an internationally recognized expert in cancer research with a focus on the role of a particular group of proteins that he'll describe today. He has a special concern about the disproportionate rate of breast cancer in minority, especially Black women. He will explain the mechanisms of the disease, the possible causes, and the demographics of the surge in breast cancer. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. Gerald Denis. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's entirely my pleasure. Thank you.
And I'd like to start, if you would, with a little background about cancer, with the mechanisms of cancer. We sort of know, well, it's cell division. Well, so if you would help us out there to understand how it works.
Sure. So everyone's familiar with familial breast cancer. So some kinds of breast cancers run in families, and probably the best known is the BRCA positive mutations that lead to breast cancer in families. Mary Claire King did a great job of doing the genetics, sort of understanding that the risk for breast cancers in families that carry this gene is very high. So by the time some women in these families reach the age of 70, the risk is 80%. And that's quite in distinction to sporadic breast cancers in most of the population where the risk is only about 10%, where there's no clear genetic origin. So there's some cancers that definitely have a genetic basis. But for most of the population, that's not the case. It's really about environmental exposures. So things like UV causing sunburns that lead to melanoma, smoking that leads to lung cancer, other kinds of exposures like arsenic or toxins in water that lead to other cancers. So that's most of what the public conversation has been about, is about environmental exposures. And the reason that's important is because those risks are what we call modifiable. In other words, the choices you make and the places you live and the things that you can do, like wearing sunscreen, reduce your risk. Whereas if you have a family history, there's very little you can do apart from, being in consultation with your doctor. So those are the two major types, sort of modifiable and non-modifiable.
Yes. Okay, I understand. And then in terms of how cancer works, you've done all this work on a group of proteins. Is that correct? That has made you quite famous, I think, in the process. But in any case, how does that work? So you in cancer, you've got this hyper multiplication of cell multiplication run amok. But how does all of this work with these proteins, the mechanisms, I guess?
Right.
How this works?
So I've spent my adult life studying the proteins that are called the BET bromodomain proteins. BET stands for bromodomain and extra-terminal domain. That's a little complicated. They're sort of units of proteins that bind to chromatin or bind to genes and control their expression. And so when you have these factors bound to promoters of genes, they turn them on. And so sometimes genes that control cell cycle or other things that are cancer related are elevated in their activity because of these proteins at higher levels than you would normally expect. But the good news is that there are small molecules that can knock down that activity and reduce that activity. And that's why there's a potential anti-cancer angle here.
I see. In that, then, are those proteins sort of activators, that system kind of, what shall I say, activated by things like toxins? Now, leaving out the genetic thing, does that sort of have any effect this is just a mechanism within the cancer production, or how do we
Yeah, so these
all of that
proteins
to
are,
the
yeah, they're
toxins? And,
right. They're present in all cells, including normal cells.
yeah,
So the way that I think that they work is by accelerating or kind of worsening an initial problem. So you might have
there.
a mutation that starts the dangerous system rolling, and these factors push that farther. They kind of accelerate it or make matters worse. And also, once you have a malignant clone that's growing, you worry about metastasis. And so these proteins are also important in regulating the growth and spread of these cancer cells to distant parts of the body,
Aha,
which is what we most worry about. Because
right.
people rarely die of their primary tumor, they die of their mets, right, to liver and
Ah,
lung and brain. So
yes,
these proteins
yes.
control that as well, particularly for breast and prostate cancer.
Okay, so this is a really central thing. You have to land on this. So again, this is in normal cellular mechanisms anyway, but what does it go berserk in cancer? If you can control it in cancer, you're onto something. Is that it?
Yes, yes, a much higher activity in cancers. So
Okay.
the whole problem with cancer is that the factors that are driving the proliferation and the metastasis are the same factors that are in normal cells. There's
Yeah.
nothing sort of Frankensteinishly unique about them, unlike, let's say, bacterial growth, where something like
Yes.
penicillin can kill bacteria and have zero effect on your normal cells. The
Yes.
cancer is difficult because these proteins are all found in normal cells anyway. So when you want to target them, you have terrible side effects. People lose their hair, and it's very difficult to have a chemotherapy because the
Right.
proteins that are being targeted are present in your normal cells too. So these are normal proteins that have deregulated activity in cancer.
Right. I see. Thank you very much for that clarification, because it's a kind of hard thing to understand. As you say, like with bacteria, that's some other bacteria, but this affects these mechanisms are in all cells, just like cell division is in all cells.
That's
So
right. We depend
all
on
of
them.
this,
So
exactly. I see. I see. Now, then you also have mentioned the imbalance, something called cytokines.
yeah, so these are inflammatory molecules that are also part of the normal process, in resolving an inflammation, for example, like an infection. You have inflammation. It's the redness that comes with an infection. So this is quite natural. But often in the people who have, let's say, metabolic disease or diabetes, that kind of
Yes.
inflammation goes up and stays up. It never goes away. And so over the course of years, that's very that's carcinogenic. So high levels of unresolved inflammation are linked to a lot of cancers,
Ah,
breast
thank
cancer,
you.
colon cancer. And so failure to resolve that sort of inflammation that's otherwise normal and healthy is actually quite dangerous and can lead to
Okay.
these other kinds of cancers.
Right. So one of the things you really have to watch out for is chronic inflammation, right? Then
Yes.
just makes you vulnerable to a lot of things. And then some other pre-existing conditions like diabetes and so on, you have also looked at, and we'd like to go into that too. So there are these pre-existing conditions that kind of set you up, make you vulnerable, right? And then why then, if we can go to these socioeconomic and demographic factors, what makes that a condition that increases your vulnerability?
Yes, right. So this is a great and complex question. So a lot of people who live in kind of lower income neighborhoods don't have access to healthy fruits and vegetables or to exercise programs. They live in what we call a food desert, and there's several of these in Boston, where you go to the corner store, there's nothing there but potato chips and chocolate
Junk.
cookies and Diet Coke. And
Yes.
so it's very difficult to get a healthy meal. And in these neighborhoods, diabetes and obesity related diabetes are very high. And these are chronic conditions that are inflammatory.
Yes.
So years of being diabetic and obese and maybe possibly other kind of chronic inflammatory complications set people up for cancers that are obesity related. And those are breast cancer, colon cancer, liver, renal. A lot of these cancers associated with obesity, I
I
think, are being
see.
driven by the inflammation that comes from being obese and diabetic. And so it's the built environment in this case that's a driver of cancer rates in these neighborhoods. And every American city has them, and they're present in rural areas as well. It's about access to healthy fruits and vegetables and also exercise. And so
Right.
this country has a chronic problem with chronic inflammation.
Aha. Now, in view of the fact that just on that obesity for a moment, obesity is very much associated with the American diet, the junk food, the processed food, which just, again, that sets you up. And then that tends to be high in areas and in populations that cannot access healthy diets and healthy living conditions. This obesity all by itself is now spreading around the world. Do you anticipate that, for example, in China, I don't know that they had a lot of breast cancer, but now figures are rising, I think, in a number of areas of the world, and seems to be, as you say, associated with obesity.
Yes. So the difficulty is, I think it's not so much obesity as the metabolic disorders that come with insulin resistance. So
Uh-huh.
in Asia, and especially in India, people in South Asia tend not to develop the really high BMI that we see in American populations.
Ah,
But people become diabetic at lower BMI, like a BMI of 22, so sort of fairly lean, but diabetic. And
I
among these
see.
populations, breast cancer is skyrocketing. So in
Aha.
urban professional populations in India, like say call center operators in Bangalore, breast cancer has doubled in the last 10 years. And I don't think it's better detection. I think it's an actual increase in incidence because of this dramatic rise in diabetes that's being driven by diet. So these are economic changes because India's economy has dramatically expanded and people are now eating far too much for their level of physical activity. And
Yes.
so, but they're not becoming obese in the way that we see in this country so much as diabetic, but lean.
Right.
And breast
Right.
cancer is very high in this population. So I really think it's the chronic inflammation related to the diabetes is driving these cancers. So it's
Aha.
not just having a high BMI. I think it's related to the inflammation.
I see. Again and again, this inflammation, and that's an interesting note that you don't have to be overweight. You can have these other conditions. Again, it just sets you up. And just by the by, what is driving that in countries like China and India, where the diet was traditionally, I might say, better than the American diet, at least didn't have this processed
Yeah,
food,
no,
junk food.
it's a couple of things. So it's a dramatic expansion of the economies of these countries and the emergence of a large, sort of well-paid, well-funded, well-nourished middle class, where these populations start out quite insulin sensitive. I mean, it's been 10,000 years of caloric restriction in much of Asia. And, so people are naturally very insulin sensitive. You just need to add a few excess calories and cut back on your activity just a little bit. Instead of walking to work, now you're sitting in a taxi in traffic for an hour. That's all it takes. It's just an imbalance in calories, energy input, energy output. And now people are developing diabetes all over Asia, but especially in India. That is the diabetes capital of the world right now. But these
Very
patterns are
interesting.
occurring in Brazil, in Mexico, in Africa. It's worldwide. So we
Yes,
call it kind of the epidemic, really, of diabetes
it does
worldwide.
sound, yes, sounds like an epidemic. And is breast cancer also following these lines?
Yes, well, so certainly it's going up in India, but it hasn't been as well studied in other countries, perhaps
Right, I
because not as
see.
much public health infrastructure. But I would
Yes.
predict, yes, that this leading edge of metabolic disease is going to have a trailing edge of breast cancer and other related cancers that we're going to see them in 5 or 10 years.
That's very interesting. How about this back to like the American groups that you have discussed? There are a couple of things. There are areas in the United States famous. You pointed out pockets of poverty where people are not able to access decent food and regular, good, healthy habits. But how about in these areas known for their toxins like Cancer Alley in Louisiana? And I'm going to ask you about the military bases too. Uh, What do you think about the rise of, I don't know if it's all cancers, breast cancer, what, that
Right.
there?
So these are many different kinds of cancers, not just breast
Uh-huh.
cancer, lymphoma, for example, and
Yeah.
leukemias. But these are often related to groundwater poisons. So
Uh-huh.
the toxification of groundwater it's a famous problem in Louisiana. So the lower end of the Mississippi Delta, because all of the farm effluent flows, of course, down the Mississippi, and there's also a lot of refineries in that area of
Yes.
Texas and Louisiana, and this huge amount of organic toxins that are released into the environment. These are all heavily carcinogenic. And people who live in that neighborhood, of course, have a terrible problem. They love their neighborhood, and they love the environment, but they're living surrounded by really dangerously polluted bayous and waterways, and fish and vegetables and anything that's grown there is heavily contaminated. So it's a terrible choice. Do you move away? Do you sue? And very often the people who live and work in these neighborhoods depend on their income from the
Yes.
very industries that are polluting their groundwater.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
it's it's a political problem.
Exactly. So that's another thing. Then the toxins can contribute to it. And then those people tend not to be wealthy. So, and for the reasons that you have mentioned, they stay put. And even if they know, but also because they are poor, they're not able to change the system, so to speak, quite so easily either.
Yeah, we think of these. I think of these as sort of interacting comorbidities. So
Yeah.
these are comorbidities of poverty and sort of a lack of political power. So living in a neighborhood that has a lot of pollution is also probably overlapping with neighborhoods that have food deserts,
Yes.
and or maybe traditional histories of racism, sort of
Yes.
structural racism in the community.
Right.
It totally overlaps. I mean, it does in Boston. So there's very, very little lung cancer screening in Boston's old redlining neighborhoods, right? These are the same
Ah,
communities. So,
yes.
so there's a long history of these factors, social factors and economic factors interacting with cancer risks.
Okay, and then you end up with a powerless population that cannot adjust anything politically to change their situation. But it takes a big program. I mean, you've got to get these toxins out or change these diets somehow, but it's all economic and political as
Well,
well.
and it's a lack of trust. So
And like,
think about Flint, Michigan. So here you have
yes,
a majority Black community that's being told by white public health officials that their water is fine.
yeah,
Here you have
yes,
thousands of children being poisoned by lead, right?
exactly,
So African American children being exposed to lead tainted water and being told by white health officials, no, no, it's fine. So we don't
exactly.
need to go very far to look at the roots of the distrust.
Yes, and on that, you have focused on that with the situation for breast cancer, the disproportionate numbers in Black women. I don't know if that applies to Latino populations as well, or but you have focused a lot on that, and again, you get the problem of not being treated honestly, and then in
Yes.
addition, not trusting.
It's a mixture both, I think, of sort of comorbidities of poverty, but also there are factors that I think are uniquely associated with African Americans that
Okay.
may have elevated cancer risk. So, for example, at Boston Medical Center, we're seeing a population of younger Black adults who are developing colon cancers at aggressive colon cancers at younger ages. And
Yes.
I think Chadwick Boseman is a great example. Very healthy otherwise, and then a young age onset colon cancer. So this is actually he's not unique. This is a pattern in the Black community of younger African Americans developing colon cancers at younger ages, and we don't understand why that is. But that
Right.
there may be a race-based association that we don't understand yet. The same is true for lung cancer. So African Americans are developing lung cancer at lower rates of packs per year. So packs smoked per
Yes.
year of cigarettes.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of standard pack per year threshold at which screening for lung cancer is recommended. But in the African American population, at least at Boston Medical Center, we're seeing people develop lung cancers at lower rates of smoking. So we don't understand that either. So
Ex-
there's some urgency here related to race that we have to try to understand. These more research is needed on this.
Absolutely. Dr. Dennis, do you think that the peculiar stress. This is awfully hard for people not under that stress to understand. I think it has been maybe we are better informed or more sympathetic as a result of the Black movement in these movements in recent years, Black Lives Matter in particular, that have brought out the peculiar stresses and long-term that we thought had gone away, the long-term stress of just living Black.
Well, it's only white people that who think this has gone away.
Exactly,
The Black
exactly.
community, none of this is news to the Black community. I mean,
Yeah,
this is an old and difficult problem,
right.
and it's
But
just made more acute by, for example, COVID mortality in the
yes,
Black community. So the rates are incredibly high, and it's very alarming. But it's also related to, again, this problem of trust. So
right.
the National Science Foundation funded a survey of Black Bostonians, in which it was discovered that something like half of Black Bostonians would refuse a COVID vaccination if it were offered. And it comes right back to Flint, Michigan, right? So
Yeah,
it's
right.
because people don't trust the system to treat them fairly. I mean, we're right back at the beginning, aren't we?
Right. And that seems to be a different thing from, say, just briefly on the COVID vaccine thing. I was astonished to hear that the French are opposed to the vaccine. Oh, come on, but that's not really a race issue there. It's something else, but it does center on that distrust for whatever reason. I think we can understand much better the situation for minorities, but particularly the Black minority, whose situation has been unique in this country, that there would be distrust and concern. But I find that interesting that you find these spikes in certain cancers, then they're in this particular population where they're not in the other populations. That's interesting.
Yes. Well, I think this ties to another point that you're making, which is about education. So
Yes,
we as science educators and clinicians and professionals have done a terrible job at educating the public in the importance of science and science funding and sort of critical thinking. The
right.
fact that there's vaccine denial happening in any case is a failure of public education. And I would propose that, basic epidemiology should be required in American public high schools. These are very straightforward concepts that everyone should be familiar with. Americans certainly were during the polio era in the 1950s.
Yes.
Everybody understood about immunization and about infectious disease. What's happened? I mean, this country put astronauts on the moon, and here we are doubting
Yes.
the efficacy of
You're
vaccines.
absolutely right. And I'd like to come back and ask you to elaborate a little bit on that in just a minute, because I want to talk about funding and so forth too. Before we leave this demographic thing, so now we've got it, you're very clear, this is way disproportionate, the breast cancer incidence in Black women is disproportionate. Some of that is that due to like pre-existing health conditions. And I want to add one more thing to this, add one more question on that. The figures from military uh, people have been staggering also. And there's a real question there. Now, these are younger people. It's a mixture of races, I think, that they are younger, they're, let's say, healthier, they're in better shape, but it's off the charts for women and men breast cancer. Do you have any information? Can you give us any information about?
Yeah, so I think some of this is about screening and medical knowledge. So cancer screening rates tend to be lower among populations where there's not a lot of trust.
Yes.
And this is especially true for African American men and prostate cancer. So that is the biggest race-based disparity of all the cancers. And even where we've taken special steps to reach out to the community and talk about the importance of screening, even at Boston Medical Center, where we're aware of this gap, still it's a persistent race-based gap in cancer outcomes. So Black men have by far the worst outcomes for prostate cancer. Partly it's a screening problem, partly it's that people don't come in until very late. Some women ignore their breast cancers until it's a little bit too late.
Yes.
So the earlier the detection, the better the outcome. This is really robustly known. But if you're in denial about it or you don't trust the system, you might resist going in to talk to your doctor about it because you're maybe in denial about how serious this might be. So some
Right.
of this is about community support and community outreach. Like let's sort of take better care of each other and of our patients so that people are caught earlier, right?
Yes, yes, I understand that, but also in terms of like this military population where people are younger, they're mixed in terms of education and so on. But there has been some interest in how this seems to spike in certain military bases, and military bases are famous for toxins. But
Yes.
do you have any information that you can give us about why there should be a rise in breast cancer in men and women who are young and fit?
Yeah, I would think this is related possibly to a combination of exposures on the base over
Okay.
the course of their work and stress. And so that's not that well studied. The good news is that the Department of Defense has special funding programs to investigate breast cancer and prostate cancer in military members and in veterans. So they're aware of the problem and they're choosing to fund research in this area. But you're right. I mean, it is a problem, and I'm glad you mentioned breast cancer in men. Most people think of breast cancer as a
Exactly.
women's health problem, but it's not. About 1% of all breast cancers occur in men, and they tend to be very aggressive, and they're very poorly understood and understudied. So we really don't know exactly how to treat them. I mean,
Yes.
there's a real gap in knowledge there. There are also federal initiatives to help study breast cancer in men, but because it's so hard to find the men to enroll in clinical
Yes.
trials,
Yes.
it still remains understudied.
I see. Yeah, I noticed in reading a little bit about that that these this has been known for more than a decade, and but there seems to be, and the military is certainly funded well for researching this, but nothing seems to happen. So that's just a curious thing, but perhaps it does take time or whatever. But your point that there may be particular things in military communities that may be generating this spike, but it's really frightening to see young
Yeah,
people like
I think it is related to both exposures and possibly to stress, and we don't understand what those exposures are. And I don't think we understand why breast cancer in men is so aggressive.
yeah,
It's dangerously aggressive and it's hard to treat, and we don't know why that is.
that's very interesting. And before we leave that, then you mentioned this business of getting people to participate, say, in these studies. Is that a problem with minorities in general, or the Black population in terms of the breast cancer research and so on? Is that a problem getting people to participate?
Well, again, it comes down to trust. So one of my close colleagues is Julie Palmer, who's the principal investigator for the Black Women's Health Study. So this was a study of 59,000 women recruited through ads and magazines in the 90s, and very high retention of this people in the study. And I think it's because of the trust. So
Uh-huh.
Dr. Palmer and others have gone to great lengths to maintain that trust with the study population. So to sort of make sure that they sort of hang together as a study cohort and that they're respected and like not exploited for samples, for example. So
Yes.
it's maintaining the trust. And that's been a very successful study. A lot is now known about Black women through the Black Women's Health Study. So
Okay, so it was because of that trust that was very
yes, I would think
important,
so. Yeah.
that willingness to participate. And then I assume that this takes place over considerable time, that these studies require considerable time. And on that, you have written and mentioned, talked about how serious the funding issue is. And that is something the public is not in on in many respects, the importance of funding. And that goes also with your interest in educating, even at the high school level, how important these
Yeah, no,
are. Tell us about that funding,
yeah,
please.
it's incredibly important to continue to fund basic research. The fact that we were so far along in drugs during the AIDS epidemic was entirely related to Nixon's war on cancer. So all of the investment during the Nixon administration in the war on cancer, because people thought cancer was caused by viruses then. and a small
Yeah.
number are, but that's basically invented the field of molecular biology.
Mhm.
So we were so quick with drugs related to AIDS because of that basic science investment. And now here we are with COVID. The fact that we're so fast to an mRNA-based vaccine that's works with lipid nanoparticles.
Yeah.
All of these technologies were funded through NIH dollars, so tax dollars that contributed to basic science research left us totally ready now, not only for the sort of the new vaccines, but for the emerging variants. So the fact
Yes.
that we can substitute in like the new variant, the B.1.1.7
Right.
variant, that can be done almost overnight because
With the mRNA, you
the
mean?
mRNA
Yeah.
vaccine, because this basic science investment has made that possible. And that is entirely American taxpayer dollars that funded basic research through NIH.
Right. What has been my understanding is that from things that you have mentioned, in fact, also that people get lopped off. They might need funding for a number of years, and then you need to renew that funding because these studies take time, just as you mentioned with the breast cancer research and the other cancer research. And not having dependable funding throws a researcher off completely. What causes that? Why isn't that funding steady?
Right. So the best example of that is the Framingham Heart Study. So,
Yes,
a study that's of incredible value, long-term studies of populations, because when you start a study, you don't know who's going to get cancer or heart disease 10 years
yes,
afterwards. So you have to enroll people at the beginning, get blood and biomarkers and find out what do we know about these people. And then 10 years later, when they get their cancer or heart attack, or whatever it is, now you have information on them and you can develop maybe a biomarker that says, oh, high risk, low risk, now we understand this. But that's a 10-year project. And so now Framingham is studying the children of the original Framingham participants. So
yeah,
you're talking multi-decade studies. So that
right,
kind of investment is essential if you want to get that sort of information. Same with the Black Women's Health Study. If you begin in 1995, a lot of those women are too young to have had cancers, but just now ovarian and breast cancers are starting to occur in that cohort. But Dr. Palmer has information on them from the very beginning. So
mhm,
now we can begin to look at risk factors, what's associated with what outcomes, and furthermore, are there people who are protected? Because that's what we all want to know. Like if you fall in a high risk group, but then you don't develop your complication, is there something that you're doing that's protecting you uniquely? And can we sort of give that to everybody?
right. That's that, and having that security of funding. And just out of curiosity, is the United States different from other nations in terms of the steady, reliable funding, whether it is or isn't?
The United States is much less reliable than other
Okay,
countries.
there,
Yes.
right, right.
So we all live from grant to grant.
Yes,
I cover 80% of my salary off of grants. So it's like I'm running a small business startup every year. And I'm getting too old for this.
yes.
It's
Yeah, and for young researchers starting out, it may be harder to get
yes, it's very
money and
difficult.
so on.
Yeah. So in
Okay,
most other countries, in Europe and in Canada and Australia, the grants pay for the research itself, the cost of
yes,
the reagents, the cost of the cells, the experiments. So the actual dollars are smaller in many other countries, but then the employment is through a university and that position doesn't go away if the grant goes away.
exactly.
In America, it does. So
Yes,
you're very likely to lose your job if you lose your grant. And
right.
this is sort of mind blowing to people from other countries. It's like, wait a minute, if reviewer two doesn't like what you proposed, now you're out of a job. So,
Yes,
so we
right,
all live with that sword hanging over our heads. And it's especially hard for younger investigators because you have to hit the ground running and
right.
write
Or
the grants and get funded. And the clock is ticking. It's a terrible
yes,
Darwinian system.
That's it. It just sounds like a Darwinian system, and I just can't help. I can't resist inserting that the mRNA virus research, the vaccine. I'm sorry, research. uh, the one of the two main people in there was a woman who actually got demoted because she couldn't get funded. And then later on, I guess she achieved fame, but it took forever, because she couldn't get funding because she couldn't show what she needed to show. And it was there all the time. So
I
anyway,
wouldn't want to be too radical, but I have a feeling that America is the only place where that would happen.
yes, and I don't know that for sure, but I'm relieved to hear you say it because it does sound like research is better supported elsewhere. And that's another thing that Americans in general are not aware of. So you have a really excellent research, but people are living from hand to mouth.
Yeah, well, I think the other problem we face is that our grants may have big budgets, so it's feast or famine. So we get
Yes,
big grant, everything's fine for 3 years, and then it goes away, and now it's zero.
yeah,
And in
right.
many other countries, that funding is much more steady. And so you
Yes,
can plan longer term, you can hire people or invest in projects that have a vision to them and perhaps a deliverable in 3 to 5 years. But in the United States, it's feast famine, feast famine.
yes,
It's impossible. You can't plan a state budget like that or a city budget.
exactly,
You have to plan
exactly,
for next year's snowfall before
exactly,
you allocate your dollars this year for snowplows. So
right.
if you didn't know that that money would be available, you're inclined to be extremely conservative about how you budget, and that means a lack of vision scientifically, right? How would we plan if you don't even know what you can do?
Right. Thank you so much for that information. Before we're going to have to close in a few minutes here, but before we leave that, I want to go back to and include this in the things you have suggested for educating the public, and it should go into a high school curriculum. And as you know, the high school, there isn't a national curriculum in anything, which puts us behind in science and math anyway. But in terms of just preparing people to be responsible and educated citizens, what you mentioned, and I think it's very interesting, the need to know about this kind of research and epidemiology and so on, and also funding. Could you please just explain what's your idea? What needs to go in that curriculum?
Yeah, well, so basic epidemiology for sure. The history of cholera in London, for example, and how a
Yes,
simple intervention like removing a handle from a pump that's
e-
contaminated solves the
exactly.
problem for the neighborhood. So something simple like that, anybody can understand that. But I also think sort of the history of medical racism and structural
Yes,
racism that's led to these chronic problems, it doesn't come from nowhere. I mean, and
yeah,
nobody chooses to have a higher risk for cancer. So can
yes,
we stop blaming the victim and think about structural origins that need structural solutions? Because we're all
right,
in this together. So like
right.
understanding like the nature of public health broadly is not about my own personal health. So I'll get mine and so
Yeah,
much for you. Like
yeah,
that's not how public health works. So sort of thinking together about how the community needs to boost public health by boosting
yes,
education and the access to medicine, that this is all part of sort of public thinking. It's civic thinking. So and good public health is intimately tied up with civic thinking.
yes,
It's about everybody's health.
right.
It's
It's
like the quality of the blood supply, for example. Right.
yes,
So if I need a transfusion, I'm relying on an anonymous donor, but that's general public health, right? I don't choose my donor, right? Who's going to give me
yes.
blood in the OR. So that's all of us relying on each other for the quality of the blood supply.
Right. So it's important in order to go forward at all and make progress in these things to have an educated public. And just in this COVID experience, we've discovered how dangerous an uneducated public is, or a public that is vulnerable to a lot of misinformation. Then, so I really appreciate I hope you'll write on it or get out there with that message that something has to be done to educate the public, and you need to start it early in like the high school curriculum. And I appreciate your comments on that very much. And Dr. Denis, I hope you will be very successful with your research. It is extremely important, extremely interesting. I really appreciate your comments here about this minorities communities and how that works, that we who are not in those communities don't realize what's going on at the time, how vulnerable these people are and why. Have you anything else you'd like to add before we close?
No, except what a great job that you're doing with public outreach like this. It's really
This is
fantastic.
wonderful information. I really appreciate it. And I'll get back to you to suggest that you please publish a whole bunch of this stuff in public access kinds of communication. Thank you ever so much for your time.
No, thank you. And it's been delightful to talk with you. Thanks, Ivan.
A pleasure, a real pleasure. I learned a lot.
Good.
You should do a weekly program.
We
Think
can talk about it. Yeah.
Think about that. Think about that. Thank you ever
Okay.
so much. A
Thanks
great
again.
pleasure. Bye.
Bye.